On the 21st of May, 1946, the People's Court sentenced Karl Frank to death by hanging for treason.
Have you ever heard of Karl Frank, the notorious SS general and executioner whose name echoes infamously through history? Behind the grim facade of power and terror was a man whose early years and radical ideologies shaped a path of destruction across Czechoslovakia. Let's delve into the life of this fearsome figure, from his troubled youth to the pivotal moments that forged his ruthless legacy. Early life and ideological formation of Karl Frank. Karl Frank's story begins in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where he was born into a world on the brink of monumental changes. His childhood was marked by the turbulence and upheaval of a crumbling empire, setting the stage for a life intertwined with conflict and radical ideology. Growing up, Frank was known as a problematic child, often finding himself embroiled in street brawls. These early signs of aggression were more than just youthful rebellion. They hinted at a deeper discontent and a propensity for violence. His participation in these fights had a lasting impact, most notably the loss of his right eye in one such skirmish. This injury forced him to wear a prosthetic eye for the rest of his life, a physical reminder of his tempestuous youth. When World War I erupted, a young Frank, eager to serve, attempted to enlist in the Austro-Hungarian army. However, his impaired vision became a roadblock, leading to his rejection. This setback did not dampen his militant aspirations, but instead redirected his path. Unable to fight on the front lines, he turned to academia, enrolling in the University of Prague to study law. It was during his university years that Frank's ideological extremism began to take shape. He was not just another student. His peers noted his fervent nationalism and admiration for the German Empire. These sentiments were not uncommon in the post-war era, as the map of Europe was redrawn and new nations emerged from the ashes of the old empires. Czechoslovakia, a new state born out of this turmoil, became a melting pot of nationalistic fervor and ethnic tensions. In this charged atmosphere, Frank found his calling in the emerging National Socialist movement. He opened a bookstore in the Sudetenland, a region with a significant ethnic German population. This store became more than just a business. It was a hub for disseminating Nazi propaganda and literature. Frank's bookstore was not merely a commercial venture, but a means to spread his radical beliefs. His commitment to the Nazi cause was unwavering, and in 1924, his efforts were recognized when he was accepted as a member of the National Socialist Party. Frank quickly rose through the ranks, his charisma and ideological zeal making him a prominent figure in the movement within Bohemia. The 1930s marked a turning point for Frank. Alongside Konrad Henlein, he co-founded the German Homeland Front of the Sudetenland. This organization, initially a political group representing the interests of ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia, soon morphed into a more radical entity. In 1933, as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, Frank's group aligned itself more closely with the Nazi regime, advocating for the annexation of the Sudetenland to Germany. Frank's political aspirations were realized when he became a deputy in the Czechoslovak parliament. From this platform, he passionately advocated for the annexation, his fiery speeches resonating with the growing sentiment among Sudeten Germans. His efforts bore fruit in 1938 when, with the acquiescence of the Allied powers, Germany annexed the Sudetenland. Frank was appointed as the vice-governor of the region, a position that solidified his status as a key Nazi figure in Czechoslovakia. However, Frank's ambitions and the Nazi regime's goals extended beyond the Sudetenland. In a blatant violation of the Munich Agreement, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Hitler proclaimed the establishment of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, appointing Konstantin von Neurath as the Reichsprotektor, with Karl Frank as his Secretary of State and head of the Gestapo in the region. This appointment marked the beginning of a reign of terror in Czechoslovakia. Frank wasted no time in implementing repressive measures against dissidents, resistance members, and anyone opposed to the German occupation. His rule was characterized by brutal crackdowns, mass arrests, and executions. Yet von Neurath was seen as too lenient, leading to his replacement by Reinhard Heydrich, a figure whose ruthlessness matched that of Frank. The rise to power. Karl Frank's ascent to power was a journey marked by opportunism, strategic alliances, and unyielding ambition. From a local agitator in the Sudetenland to a key player in the Nazi hierarchy, his rise was both rapid and ruthless. In the early 1930s, following his involvement with the German homeland front of the Sudetenland, Frank's influence began to grow beyond local politics. His ability to galvanize the ethnic German population in Czechoslovakia caught the attention of higher-ups in the Nazi Party. When the group transformed into the Sudeten German Party in 1933, coinciding with Hitler's ascension to power in Germany, Frank's political career took a significant leap. His fervent advocacy for the annexation of the Sudetenland to Germany resonated with the Nazi leadership. His impassioned speeches in the Czechoslovak parliament and public rallies presented him as a staunch proponent of Nazi ideals, fervently pushing for the expansion of the Third Reich. This alignment with Nazi objectives was instrumental in his political ascent. Frank's rhetoric and actions were not just about annexation, but were deeply rooted in the broader Nazi agenda of racial purity and German supremacy. When the Munich Agreement in 1938 allowed for the annexation of the Sudetenland by Germany, Frank's position in the party was further elevated. He was appointed vice governor of the newly annexed region, an acknowledgement of his pivotal role in the successful expansion of Nazi territory. This was more than a political reward. It was a strategic move by the Nazis to place a loyal and proven leader in a key position. The following year marked a crucial turning point for Frank. The German occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia and the establishment of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia saw him climb even higher in the Nazi hierarchy. Appointed as the Secretary of State and head of the Gestapo in the region, Frank had effectively become the second most powerful Nazi in Czechoslovakia. His role was crucial in implementing the Nazi policies of repression and racial cleansing in the Protectorate. Frank's tenure under Konstantin von Neurath, the initial Reichsprotektor, was marked by an aggressive crackdown on any form of resistance or dissent. His methods were brutal, and his reputation as a ruthless enforcer of Nazi policies grew. However, von Neurath's comparatively moderate approach to governance in the Protectorate was soon seen as insufficient by the Nazi leadership. This led to the appointment of Reinhard Heydrich as the new Reichsprotektor in 1941, a move that signaled a shift towards even more brutal methods of suppression.
Lebensgebiet für Lebensgebiet wird als Pfeiler des Ganzen für sich neu gestaltet und gebaut.
Frank and Heydrich shared a common vision for the Protectorate, one rooted in extreme brutality and oppression. They worked in tandem to crush any opposition, deploying harsh measures that included mass executions and deportations. Their reign was characterized by a reign of terror, where dissent was met with immediate and merciless punishment. The partnership between Frank and Heydrich was a dark period for Czechoslovakia. Their actions were not limited to political repression, but extended to racial extermination as well. They orchestrated the systematic elimination of Jews and Romani people, contributing significantly to the Holocaust's horrors in the region. Frank's influence peaked after Heydrich's assassination in 1942. The assassination, carried out by Czech resistance fighters, was a significant blow to the Nazi administration in Czechoslovakia. In the wake of Heydrich's death, Frank assumed even greater responsibilities. He was pivotal in orchestrating the Nazis. Brutal retaliation, including the infamous destruction of the villages of LIDICE and Lezaky, where men were executed, women deported, and children taken away. These acts of retaliation were some of the most heinous war crimes committed during World War II, etching Frank's name in history as a symbol of Nazi cruelty. As the war progressed, Frank's power continued to grow. His relentless pursuit of Nazi objectives, coupled with his ruthless efficiency, made him one of the most feared and influential Nazi leaders in occupied Czechoslovakia. By the war's end, he had become a symbol of the horrors inflicted by the Nazi regime on Europe. The Reign of Terror in Czechoslovakia. Karl Frank's tenure as a key Nazi official in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was characterized by a relentless and brutal campaign of repression and terror. This period stands as one of the darkest in Czech history, marked by a systematic destruction of human rights, dignity, and life under Frank's direct supervision. When Frank assumed power, Czechoslovakia was already under the heavy shadow of Nazi occupation. His appointment as the Secretary of State and head of the Gestapo in the region signaled the beginning of an even more oppressive era. Frank's strategy was clear from the outset: to crush any form of resistance or opposition to Nazi rule, using any means necessary. He orchestrated a campaign of terror, deploying Gestapo and SS forces to conduct mass arrests, interrogations, and executions. Under Frank's regime, the Gestapo became a symbol of fear. They were notorious for their brutal methods of interrogation and torture. Frank's orders were unequivocal: identify, arrest, and eliminate anyone who posed a threat to Nazi control. This included political dissidents, members of the resistance, intellectuals, and anyone deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The extent of Frank's repression was not limited to political opponents. It extended to entire communities. He was instrumental in implementing the Nazi policy of racial hygiene in Czechoslovakia. Jews and Romani people were systematically rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Frank's role in this genocidal campaign was active and unapologetic. Under his watch, thousands were deported to death camps like Auschwitz, where they met a grim fate. The Jewish and Romani communities in Czechoslovakia were decimated, their vibrant presence reduced to mere memories in the wake of Frank's terror. One of the most notorious episodes of Frank's reign was the response to the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. Heydrich, known as the Butcher of Prague, was a close ally of Frank, and his death at the hands of Czech resistance fighters marked a turning point in the occupation. Frank's reaction was swift and savage. He ordered reprisals that were brutal even by Nazi standards. The villages of LIDICE and Lezaky were targeted for their perceived support of the resistance. In what became one of the most infamous war crimes of the Second World War, the male inhabitants of LIDICE were executed en masse, while women and children were either deported to concentration camps or selected for Germanization. The destruction of LIDICE and Lezaky was not just an act of revenge, it was a calculated move by Frank to send a chilling message to the rest of Czechoslovakia. The message was clear: any opposition to Nazi rule would be met with the most extreme forms of punishment. These atrocities were widely publicized by the Nazi propaganda machine, both as a warning to others and as a demonstration of the Reich's power. Frank's reign was also marked by a systematic crackdown on Czech culture and identity. He sought to suppress any expression of Czech nationalism or pride. Czech schools were closed, and German became the official language. The Nazi regime, with Frank as a key enforcer, aimed to erase Czech history and culture, replacing it with Germanic influence. As the war progressed and the tide began to turn against the Nazis, Frank's regime became even more desperate and brutal. He intensified his efforts to quell resistance, resulting in more arrests, torture, and executions. The Czech people, however, were undeterred. The resistance grew stronger, fueled by the atrocities committed by Frank and his Gestapo. Acts of sabotage, assassinations, and guerrilla warfare became more frequent, presenting a significant challenge to Nazi control. Frank's reign of terror in Czechoslovakia was a stark illustration of the depths of human cruelty and the devastating impact of totalitarian regimes. His actions were driven by a fanatical adherence to Nazi ideology and a ruthless ambition for power. The suffering he inflicted on the Czech people left deep scars that would take generations to heal. The destruction of LIDICE and Lezaky. The destruction of the Czech villages of LIDICE and Lezaky stands as one of the most heinous acts of retribution during World War II. a chilling testament to the cruelty of Karl Frank and the Nazi regime. These atrocities, orchestrated as a response to the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, reveal the depths of brutality reached under Frank's command. In May 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, the acting Reichsprotektor of Bohemia and Moravia and a close associate of Karl Frank, was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters. This event sent shockwaves through the Nazi leadership, provoking a furious response. Karl Frank, then the Secretary of State and head of the Gestapo in the region, was quick to act, implementing a series of brutal reprisals. The village of LIDICE was selected for retribution based on false accusations of harboring the assassins. On June 10, 1942, German forces surrounded LIDICE. The ensuing operation was ruthless and calculated. All men over 16 years of age were rounded up and executed in cold blood. The women of LIDICE were separated and sent to concentration camps, while children were subjected to a cruel fate. Some were selected for Germanization and sent to Nazi families, while others were sent to concentration camps or killed. The destruction of LIDICE was methodical. Every building in the village was burned or razed to the ground. Even the dead were not spared in dignity. The local cemetery was desecrated. The village was wiped off the map, its existence meant to be forgotten, as a grim warning to any who would dare oppose Nazi rule. But the horror did not end with LIDICE. Shortly thereafter, the small village of Lezaky suffered a similar fate. On June 24, 1942, German forces descended upon Lezaky. Following the same pattern as in LIDICE, the men were executed, and the women and children were deported. The village was completely destroyed, erasing another community from the Czech landscape. The brutality of these actions was unprecedented. The complete annihilation of both villages and the murder of their inhabitants were acts of barbarism that shocked the world. These were not just military operations, they were acts of terror, designed to instill fear and demonstrate the lengths to which the Nazi regime would go to maintain control. Karl Frank was directly responsible for these atrocities. His orders were clear and unequivocal, reflecting a complete disregard for human life and dignity. The executions and the destruction of LIDICE and Lezaky were carried out under his command, and he bore the full responsibility for these crimes against humanity. The impact of the destruction of LIDICE and Lezaky extended far beyond the immediate horror of the massacres. These events became symbols of the Nazi regime's cruelty and the resistance against it. The memory of LIDICE and Lezaky galvanized anti-Nazi sentiment, both within Czechoslovakia and internationally. The atrocities were widely condemned, and they served as a rallying cry for those fighting against Nazi oppression. In the years following the war, LIDICE and Lezaky became poignant memorials to the victims of Nazi terror. The stories of these villages and their inhabitants were preserved as a reminder of the atrocities committed and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Downfall and capture. The downfall of Karl Frank, the infamous Nazi official and architect of terror in Czechoslovakia, was as dramatic as his rise to power. As World War II neared its end, the Nazi regime crumbled under the weight of the advancing Allied forces, leading to Frank's eventual capture and the closing of a dark chapter in history. By early 1945, the tide of the war had turned decisively against Germany. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east, while the Western Allies pushed from the west. In Czechoslovakia, resistance against Nazi occupation intensified, fueled by years of repression and atrocities committed by Karl Frank and his regime. The Czech people, emboldened by the nearing end of Nazi dominance, began to rise in open rebellion. Amidst this chaos, Frank's grip on power began to weaken. His brutal tactics, which had once instilled fear, now sparked defiance and resistance. As the Nazi war machine faltered, Frank's authority crumbled, and the inevitability of defeat loomed. Despite the desperate situation, Frank refused to relinquish control, clinging to his fading power with delusional determination. In the final days of the war, Prague became a focal point of conflict. As Soviet and American forces closed in, the Czech resistance launched the Prague Uprising in early May 1945, a bold attempt to free the city from Nazi control before the arrival of the Allies. Karl Frank, defiant to the end, responded with typical brutality. He ordered SS troops to crush the uprising, leading to fierce street battles throughout the city. Prague was engulfed in chaos, with Czech fighters battling against the remnants of the Nazi forces. However, Frank's efforts to retain control were in vain. The sheer force of the Allied advance and the determination of the Czech resistance made the Nazi defeat inevitable. On May 9, 1945, Prague was liberated by Soviet troops, signaling the end of Nazi rule in the city. Frank, realizing the futility of further resistance, fled Prague in a desperate attempt to evade capture. Frank's flight was short-lived. On May 9th, the same day Prague was liberated, he was captured by American forces. His capture marked the end of a reign of terror that had brought untold suffering to the people of Czechoslovakia. Karl Frank, once a feared and powerful Nazi official, was now a prisoner, facing the consequences of his actions. Following his capture, Frank was extradited to Czechoslovakia to stand trial for his crimes. The trial was a significant event, symbolizing the triumph of justice over tyranny. Frank was charged with a litany of crimes, including the murder and persecution of civilians, the destruction of LIDICE and Lezaky, and his role in the Holocaust. The evidence against him was overwhelming, a testament to the brutality of his regime. During the trial, Frank displayed little remorse for his actions. He attempted to justify his crimes by citing his loyalty to the Nazi cause and obedience to orders. However, his justifications fell on deaf ears. The severity of his crimes and the suffering he had inflicted were beyond excuse or explanation. In the end, Karl Frank was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his offenses. The trial and subsequent execution of Karl Frank were not just a matter of retributive justice. They were a symbolic act, representing the end of Nazi tyranny in Czechoslovakia and the beginning of a process of healing and reconciliation. The execution of Karl Frank. The execution of Karl Frank, the notorious Nazi official responsible for some of the most heinous crimes of World War II, marked a significant moment of justice and retribution. This event not only signified the end of Frank's reign of terror in Czechoslovakia, but also served as a symbolic act of closure for the countless victims of Nazi atrocities. After his capture and extradition to Czechoslovakia, Frank faced trial for his war crimes. The evidence presented was irrefutable, painting a vivid picture of his ruthless campaign against the Czech people. His direct involvement in the destruction of LIDICE and Lezaky, as well as his role in the persecution and murder of Jews and Romani people, were laid bare for the world to see. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning with the horrors of the Nazi occupation. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Frank remained defiant. Throughout the trial, he showed little remorse for his actions, instead attempting to justify them as acts of war and loyalty to Nazi ideology. However, the severity of his crimes and the suffering he had inflicted on thousands left no room for excuses. The court found him guilty on all counts, sentencing him to death by hanging. The date of the execution, May 22, 1946, was set to be a day of reckoning. In the early hours of the morning, Frank was led to the gallows, located in the courtyard of Pankrak prison in Prague. The atmosphere was tense, with a palpable sense of both somber reflection and anticipation of justice among the gathered crowd. The execution was not only a punishment for Frank, but also a symbol of the triumph of justice over tyranny. As Frank stood on the gallows, he faced a crowd of thousands, including survivors of his brutal regime, resistance fighters, and ordinary citizens who had suffered under Nazi rule. His final moments were marked by a chilling calmness. Frank's last words were a testament to his unrepentant nature, showing no sign of remorse or recognition of the enormity of his crimes. When the moment of execution arrived, the hangman performed his duty. The fall of the trapdoor and the snap of the rope marked the end of Karl Frank's life, a life that had been marked by cruelty, oppression, and a relentless pursuit of power at the expense of humanity. The crowd's reaction was a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a somber acknowledgement of the horrors that had been inflicted upon their nation. Frank's body was subsequently buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery of Pankrak Prison, a fittingly anonymous end for a man who had sought so much power and inflicted so much pain. His execution was not only a punishment for his individual crimes, but also a symbolic act of justice for the victims of the Nazi regime. The execution of Karl Frank had a profound impact on Czechoslovakia and beyond. It served as a powerful reminder of the consequences of totalitarian rule and the importance of holding those in power accountable for their actions. For the Czech people, it was a moment of catharsis, a step towards healing the deep wounds left by years of occupation and repression. In the years following the execution, the legacy of Karl Frank and the horrors he perpetrated continued to resonate. Memorials were erected in LIDICE and Lezaky, serving as poignant reminders of the atrocities committed and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such brutality. These sites became symbols of remembrance and a warning against the dangers of hatred and extremism.